Nintendo is without a doubt one of the most important companies in video game history. The popularity of the NES in the mid-80s led to the industry's recovery from the crash of 1983. And for nearly 40 years, Nintendo has innovated and redefined the video game experience. But what if Nintendo never entered the video game industry? What if they just stuck with trading cards? How different would the video game landscape be today if it weren't for Nintendo and the innovations they brought to the table? In the previous alternate history video, we explored what would happen if Sega didn't stop making consoles. If the Dreamcast was not the last console that Sega made, how different would the video game industry be? And we concluded that things wouldn't really be all that different in the grand scheme of things. But when we asked the question about what would happen if Nintendo never released the Nintendo Entertainment System or the Game Boy, it's the exact opposite. The video game industry today would be completely unrecognizable without the innovations and accomplishments made by Nintendo over the past few decades. For starters, I don't think that the console gaming market would be nearly as big as it is right now without the release of the NES, which resurrected the console market from the crash of 1983. By 1985, Atari was still in disarray. They were going bankrupt and they got bought by another company, and they were just all over the place. They never recovered from the 83 crash, and nothing would have been different with or without Nintendo. That company was going to go downhill no matter what. And Mattel, who made the Intellivision back then, they had already exited the console market, as well as the Coleco. So there was a huge void in the console market back then because nobody was really making consoles, and the consoles that did come out didn't really captivate an audience. But then Nintendo came out and released the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America, and the industry started to recover because they released games that people wanted to play with impressive 8-bit graphics at the time at a fairly reasonable price. So if we didn't get the NES, the console market, I feel the collapse of the console market would have been extended, and I don't know if it ever would have recovered, at least not as much as it did in the real timeline with Nintendo. Maybe some other company would have come in, but that begs the question, what company would that be? Sega, for example, they were Nintendo's biggest competitor back then. They released a Master System, but the Master System was based off the NES because their console, the SG-1000, was released in 83, and they decided to get rid of the SG-1000, discontinue it like after a year, and then come out with the Master System because of the 8-bit graphics that Nintendo had that blew the SG-1000 out of the water. So the NES inspired Sega to release the Master System, and without the NES, it's probably safe to presume that the Master System would not have happened. So Sega may not have had as much of an impact on the gaming industry as they eventually did with the Genesis and Sonic the Hedgehog. It's possible that none of that could have ever happened without Nintendo and the influence they had on the gaming industry at the time. Even the Sony PlayStation was inspired by Nintendo. Anyone familiar with the history of the PlayStation knows that the reason why Sony got involved in the console market in the first place had to do with Nintendo betraying Sony for the Nintendo PlayStation project that would have been a CD expansion for the Super Nintendo, but Nintendo decided to work with Philips instead without informing Sony, and were going behind Sony's back, and Sony felt betrayed, so they felt they had to respond, so that's why we got the PlayStation. But without Nintendo, without the Super Nintendo, or without Nintendo existing at all in the gaming industry, the PlayStation would have never existed more likely than not. So not only does that mean we don't get Mario, we don't get Zelda, we don't get Metroid, all these amazing Nintendo games, but it also means that we don't get Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Uncharted, and all the amazing PlayStation exclusives that we ended up getting in the real timeline. Now, it's possible that Sega, Sony, or some other company I never even mentioned would have been able to innovate the gaming industry in place of Nintendo. But even so, the gaming industry today would look fundamentally different without Nintendo's influence. I would even go as far as to say that console gaming would not be nearly as relevant as it is now had Nintendo not gotten involved. Perhaps with the console market collapsed, PC gaming would have become more popular in the 1980s and 1990s to the point that it becomes the most popular gaming platform on the market. So I would imagine that if we could explore the year 2020 in an alternate timeline where Nintendo never existed, a lot more people would be playing their games on a keyboard and mouse than with a controller. Not only because Nintendo shaped what a modern controller would look like, but also because the NES resurrected the console market. So without the NES, I can't imagine the console market doing nearly as well as it ended up doing. Not to mention that handheld gaming would be practically non-existent because what Nintendo did with the NES for the console market, is what Nintendo also did for the handheld market with the Game Boy. So overall, I'm having a really hard time imagining what the gaming experience would look like without Nintendo. A world without Nintendo is almost difficult to comprehend. Cause what would have ended up happening without them? I don't even know, because almost everything that we have in modern gaming, Nintendo's had at least some influence on it. So while I think the gaming industry would still exist, I don't think it would be nearly as big, and it would be almost unrecognizable from what we're used to right now. We never would have had the D-pad, which, to think no D-pad, I mean, that's definitely one of the most important inventions in gaming history. So not to have that is almost unimaginable. Not to mention the amazing games we got from Nintendo, but without Nintendo, a lot of the other companies that would end up innovating later on would not have been able to be successful without Nintendo paving the way for them to do so. Which makes me think that PC gaming would probably be the default gaming option for most people and be the most popular platform for video games and would be where all the innovation happens. But I want to know what you guys think. What would a world without Nintendo have looked like? And also leave a comment if you have any suggestions for future alternate history scenarios. But that's it for me. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all later. Bye.